2017中华民国儿童权利公约首次国家报告国际审查会议，会议开始。We will now start a review meeting. Mr. Dork, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies. We are about to start the review of the first report of the Republic of China, Taiwan, on the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I assume you are more or less familiar with that process. It's conducted during 2 days, at least 1.5 days, and it's following the clustering of the articles of the Convention. As you know, there are 41 substantive articles in the Convention. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has clustered the articles under certain themes. And we followed that clustering as the government did in its reporting on the implementation of the CRC. And tomorrow, we will try to deal with and complete the questions and answers related to the first 3 clusters. Cluster 1 is on general measures of implementation. Cluster 2 is on the definition of the child. And Cluster 3 is on the general principles of the Convention as identified by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. They are the Articles 2, 3, Paragraph 1, 6, and 12. Non-discrimination, the best interest of the child, the right to life, survival, and development, and the right of the child to express her or his views. So the order of this morning will be as follows, after also consultation with the head of the delegation. The delegation of the government first will be presented with questions of members of the committee on Chapter 1 and 2. And we may start with Chapter 2, because that is on the definition of the child, and as you know, Article 1 defines the scope of applicability of the Convention. On children, children are defined as persons below the age of 18. And then followed by questions on Chapter 1, or Cluster 1. Then we have a short break for the head of the delegation to assign certain members of the delegation to answering certain questions. So that will be a small break. You don't need to leave. You don't need to move. You can stay where you are. And then the answering. After the answering, we will have a short break for various reasons. Let's summarize it as health reasons. Stretch your leg, get some coffee or whatever you need by that time. And then we will have Cluster 3 on the general principles, followed by answers from the delegation of the government. The schedule sounds quite strict. We are flexible. If we don't complete the answering on Cluster 3, the general principles, we will continue with the answering process in the afternoon after 2 o'clock. But in principle, after 2 o'clock, we will deal with clusters 4, 5, and 6. but that is for the afternoon. Can I invite the head of the delegation? Oh, no, we start. The head of the delegation, anything to observe, remark, or whatever? You want to say anything?
Professor Duke and dear representatives from the government. And today what we're going to do is that we collect all the questions, and then the agency representatives will discuss who to answer the questions. So we will focus on chapter 1. We'll probably have 15 minutes for chapter 1, and following our answers, the committee members may still follow up if they deem the answers not satisfactory. So this is how the questioning and answering is organized. And I'll probably ask some representatives to add information. So basically, we will go through the proceedings per the chairman's instructions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. We will start, as I told you, with the questions from members of the committee. So, as I said, we start with cluster or chapter 2 on the definition of the child. Mrs. Karp, you have the floor.
Good morning. I must say that I'm very impressed by the work the government has done, both in the report and the written answers. And it seems that you are convinced to go on to implement the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, I have few questions with regard to the age of majority, or ages. And my first question is with regard to the discriminatory age of marriage, the differentiation between males and females in the age of marriage. I understand from the written replies that you have already an amendment in the proceedings. And my question is, as our previous review committees recommended to amend the law, it took some years until the amendment has been debated. My question is, what are the real problems that prevented you from finalizing this amendment? And are there any recommendation for timetable for finalizing this amendment? My second question relates to the age of majority, and mainly to sector of so-called children between the ages of 18 and 20 that are restricted in the rights in the name of protection. While the age of criminal responsibility is 18 and the age of marriage is 18, and there are lower ages for other functions, it seems that for the civil code and for the right to vote, the age of 20 is raising questions because it seems that in the name of protection, children are, or persons, young persons, are restricted in their ability to participate in administrative and legal proceedings. So they are prevented from bringing complaints. They are restricted in the right of association, of not being able to join a labor, a trade union. It seems that a young person at the age of 18 who finishes school cannot hire an apartment without the consent of his parents. So I understand from the written answers that there have been a year ago a poll to ask people whether they are in favor of changing the age of majority to 18. And it seems that the poll showed that most of the people who were participating in this poll were tended to preserve their rights of protection over the children. And I would like to understand why is the basis, let's say, infringements of the right of young persons between the age of 18 is decided by public opinion when, in my opinion, I think that the government has to lead. I guess that if you were asking in polls whether parents would like to have the Convention of the Right of the Child implemented here, they would be afraid of the change. I know that you are moving from a society, traditional society, with attitudes of paternalism, to move to a democracy and to the understanding that children they are the subjects of rights. It's not clear to me whether, I mean, in the written answers, you say that this debate can still go on in the public, but I wonder whether the debate is not necessarily have to go on in the government and in the legislative yuan. So what are the prospects of helping this group of children? By the way, I think we don't have the statistics of the number of children between 18 and 20, and I would like to understand how many children are in this shadow group that, according to the Convention of the Right of the Child, are in fact full human being entitled to full human rights, including the right of association, the freedom of speech, etc. Thank you.
Okay. Moving to cluster 1 on general measure of implementation, and Mrs. Lundy has the floor.
Thank you for the very helpful answers to the list of issues. I have some follow-up questions in relation to implementation. The first question relates to the first two optional protocols. I'm not sure I understand the answer in the list of issues. It says that I think there's an assumption that it will be adopted because it will be referred to by the committee in general comments. And my question is, are there no plans or are there plans to adopt the first two optional protocols? The second question relates to an independent human rights mechanism. We're told that the executive yuan fulfills that function, but we think children should have access to both an independent mechanism and also, very importantly, to something where that is child-friendly, that is accessible to them if they want to make a complaint. So the question is, what can be done to ensure that children have access to an independent, child-friendly complaints mechanism? Third set of questions relate to public budgeting and spend. Thank you again for the information that you gave us on public expenditure, and it was good to see this attempt to have a child budget and to show a rise in spending. My two follow-up questions. First is what plans you have to make that budget transparent so that it is accessible not just to the general public, but to children and young people, so they can see what their government is spending and where they're spending it. The second question on budgeting relates to some of the issues we discussed yesterday, and that is about the extent to which central government monitors spending at council and city level. So the budget is still, and the obligation on the budget is still a central government responsibility under the Convention, but there questions were raised about whether money that is spent locally is always spent well, or whether there is sufficient money in local areas. So to what extent is that monitored? Fourth set of questions relates to coordination. And again, thank you for your response on that there is a committee looking at that. Our question is the extent, if there are any plans to have a higher level unit in central government, a children's committee, or a ministry for children, because that is the type of mechanism that we think is needed to ensure there is good cooperation for children across all government ministries. And my final set of questions relate to education and training, knowledge and awareness of the Convention. And the first question relates to training of adults. In response to the list of issues, we were told about training for government officials and some social welfare. Our question is, to what extent are the other adults who work with children, teachers, social workers, lawyers, doctors, nurses, do they receive training on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, on a child rights approach? And finally, training on the Convention for children. We're informed that children all get human rights education, and it's said that children's rights will be a part of that. The question is that a discretion for schools? Do they get to decide whether to teach children about children's rights as part of human rights education? We have a sense from the children yesterday that there is very low awareness of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Have you done any research? Do you know how many children have heard of it? How many schools are teaching it? Those are my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lundy. Other members of the committee, questions? Mr. Tobin.
Thank you all for your attendance this morning. I'm unbelievably impressed by your commitment to the implementation of the Convention, and I thank you also for your report and list of response to list of issues. I have one question in relation to the training of follow-up to lawyers. We understand there's quite a bit of training, but my question is, of the training that is done, is there monitoring and evaluation as to how effective that might be on an ongoing basis? Question one. Question two relates to contracts between the government agencies and private contractors. When those contracts are entered for the provision of services relating to children, do they include terms that require compliance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child? Question three relates to children's views and how they're expressed, and we picked up again in Article 12, but I just want to flag, yesterday we heard many concerns from young people that are important for us to be aware of and also for you. The issue for us is the willingness of the government to establish a National Children's Council or some type of institution or format that would allow for their views to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you. One question from me is about the relationship between the provision of the Convention and the domestic law. In the responses to our questions, you informed us, and it's also part of the report, that the provisions of the Convention have the status of domestic law. But as you know, as lawyers, we make our living from addressing conflicts. And the possible conflict is a conflict to an existing domestic law provision and a provision in the CRC. And the simple question is, if the judge has to decide on that particular conflict, is she or he expected or even obliged to give preference to the Convention on the Rights of the Child? So in simple and legal words, what is prevailing? CRC provision or domestic law provision? I think that is my additional question. I invite the head of the delegation. We take a small break so that the head of the delegation can a little bit discuss with the members of the delegation who is going to answer which question. We are not expecting that you exactly follow the order of the questions. You are free to start with the last question, or with the first, or some in the middle.
刚刚的问题，看看是谁要来回。
Okay, so the question from Professor Karp is about the different ages for marriage for men and women, and we are talking about the definition of the child. So the first key question is about the different ages for marriage. When are we planning to pass the amendment? The second question is about the age of majority. In our law, it's set at 20. For those aged between 18 and 20, how many people are falling into this category? What restrictions or limitations are there on their rights? I believe the Ministry of Justice will be answering the question. The third question is, our poll shows that parents still believe children must be protected, but a lot of 18 to 20-year-old believe they are mature enough. So how do we initiate more discussions with the legislators to start necessary revisions to laws and regulations? Maybe later, the Social and Family Affairs Administration can answer the question. And another question is, optional protocols. Do we plan to ratify and adopt these two protocols? Again, the Social and Family Affairs Administration is going to answer the question. Also, there's a question about our oversight of the provision of protection to children. There's a question about the budget. Again, Social and Family Affairs Administration can answer the question. Can we make the budgeting process more transparent, not only to adults, but also to children? And is the central government monitoring the allocation and expenditure of city and county governments for children? And are we going to set up a children's council at the national level? Next question is about training. I think this is a very serious issue. Do we make sure that all those involved in protecting and serving children are receiving the necessary training in relation to CRC. Again, Social and Family Affairs Administration can share with us what kind of training we have organized so far. Next question is, are teachers at schools teaching human rights courses to their students? Have we consulted students or children about what they have learned from such human rights education? And the next question comes from Professor Tobin. Again, it's about the CRC-related training. Is there any monitoring system in place to make sure the training is effective? Next question is, do we have a national level of policymaking mechanism that involves children in policy making? Okay, and Professor Duke also asked about the precedence of domestic law or the CRC provisions. So if there's any conflict between our domestic law and the CRC provisions, which takes precedence? Again, the Social and Family Affairs Administration can answer this question. So maybe I can ask our colleague from the Ministry of Justice to answer the question relating to the age for marriage and the age of majority. What we plan to do in this regard. So, please. In response to the questions concerning the age of marriage in our civil code and the differences between men and women, in 2011, our ministry actually proposed a bill to amend the provisions so that girls' marriage age will be lifted to 18. But then the bill was reviewed at the Legislative Yuan. The legislators had different opinions. So during that session, the amendment did not get reviewed and passed. And in the subsequent session, we at the executive branch would have to make a proposal again. But at that time, in 2014, we invited scholars and experts to engage in discussions whether or not the revision was necessary. And the scholars and experts suggested that in addition to revising upwards the age of marriage, relevant laws and regulations should also be revised accordingly. In addition to the ongoing discussions at the executive branch, in 2014 and 2016, the Legislative Yuan also saw some proposals about lifting upward the age of marriage for women to 18. While these bills were being reviewed at the Legislative Yuan, it was pointed out that such revision was in keeping with the spirit of the CRC and the CEDAW. So to lift the girls' age of marriage from 16 to 18, according to the Ministry of Justice, is definitely in keeping with the provisions of the CRC. So that is our stance. I would like to make it clear now. In addition, in 2016, the proposed bill was already reviewed at the Legislative Yuan, and it was already passed by the legal committee under the Legislative Yuan, and the review process is still ongoing. We will also keep watching the progress at the Legislative Yuan. In 2013 and 2016, when different bills were proposed by the Legislative Yuan, many of them also touched upon the same-sex marriage. In other words, in addition to revising upwards the gross age of marriage, they inevitably also touched upon the same-sex marriage issue. And the Grand Justices also made a decision that same-sex marriage should be recognized. That's why the proposal made in 2016, and based on the Grand Justice's interpretation, these bills would have to be reviewed and finalized by May 2019. In other words, all these bills, different versions, will have to touch upon same-sex marriage as well. As for the age of majority, again, the Ministry of Justice. Good morning, members of the committee. As for the lowering the age of majority from 20 to 18, well, we know that laws in this regard are determined by the maturity of the population in different countries. That's why different countries have different practices. We have to take into account our local practices and mores. As far as I know, some countries even set the age of majority at 21. As for the well, if we do reduce or lower the age of majority, there are a lot of implications we have to take into account. First of all, we believe people aged above 20 will have full capacity, and for those who are under 20, their parents and guardians are still responsible for supporting them. If we do lower the age of majority to 18, is it really in the best interest of those aged between 18 and 20? In addition, a lot of children still have to get consent from their parents before they engage in certain acts. And this particular requirement is not to impose restrictions on their rights. Rather, it's part of a protection measure. The Civil Code basically sets the age of majority at 20, while the Criminal Code sets the age of majority at 18. I think they are set differently for different reasons, because the Criminal Code basically stipulates what can be done and what cannot be done, whereas the Civil Code is really stipulates about the right to engage in administrative acts or judicial acts. Therefore, the two sets of laws are stipulated for different reasons. For children aged under 20, I think it is questionable whether or not they are mature enough or have sufficient capacity to engage in administrative or legal acts. Moreover, according to Article 180 of the Civil Code, if a child is involved in a car accident, if the driver that caused the accident was an underage person, then his parents will be held accountable for this incident as well. In other words, the victim would have better protection. For those aged between 18 and 20, most of them are still in schools. They are not independent economically. Therefore, we don't want to infringe upon the rights of the victim of a car incident, for example, to make claims for compensation. As for the population aged between 18 and 20, it's about 3.2% of our total population. Before the poll and after the poll, basically, this particular group of people in this poll expressed the same preferences. 60% of them are opposed to making changes. So it's not that we rely upon the poll results to decide whether or not we want to change the law. Again, if we lower the age of majority, a lot of relevant laws and regulations will have to be revised as well. So the implications can be very far-reaching. According to the poll, only 33.8% of the respondents approved of the idea. 61.7% still oppose the idea. So there doesn't seem to be a pressing need to revise the law for the age of majority. That's why we will continue to watch how people prefer in this regard. And we will also look into how protection for those aged between 18 and 20 can be improved. That's all. Thank you.
Next, I would like to ask the Social and Family Affairs Administration to respond to a few questions. Thank you very much for all the questions. I would like to start with the precedence or the prevalence of CRC. In our country, CRC has been made domestic law through an implementation act of CRC. And as for the two optional protocols, so far they have not yet become domestic laws. And in the implementation act, it states that laws and administrative measures have to consider the interpretation of CRC and general comments made by the CRC committee. And the two optional protocols are also included in the considerations that the government need to take. I think maybe after a period of time, we may also adopt the two optical protocols so that they can become domestic laws. That's my first response. Secondly, as for a dedicated agency for children's affairs, I understand that the Executive Yuan currently and have a promotional group or a promotional team for children's rights. So the minister without portfolio will convene civil groups and scholars to have discussions. And much of the coordination has to be taken, will be discussed at this kind of meetings. We've heard opinions from NGOs and experts, and therefore have a better direction. And at the ministry level, there is a promotion group for children's rights as well. So at the executive yuan and also at MOHW, there are both promotional teams for children's rights. As for budgeting, let me address the monitoring of budgeting spent by the local government first. But every 2 years, the central government will evaluate the local government and understand how they're allocating the budget. And the statistical office at the central government will also monitor how these resources are being used. So this is about the monitoring of the local government. And indeed, people talk about that such budgeting is not yet enough, and we will continue to work harder to increase the budget. As for whether the budgeting is transparent, people are free to go online and see the details of budget for many projects. Children and youth themselves are able to go online to see these details as well. Regarding training and education, this has to be relied upon more than the Ministry of Health and Welfare. So in the Implementation Act of CRC, well, after it is concluded, MOHW, that is Ministry of Health and Welfare, and ask local government to strengthen training for professionals who work children and strengthen the training of general public. There's always room for improvement. We will work harder, but we do ask all the agencies to work together. And promotional materials and that are being used for such promotion are included in the initial report already. And next question is whether children and youth join the process of devising policies. Well, according to the Implementation Act, and according to regulation of Legislative Yuan, children representatives are invited to discuss some issues that are related to them. At the executive yuan level and the ministry level, we hope that such a process can allow children participation because they are at the heart of such policies. As for the establishment of Children's Council, I think the priority now is to empower children. We need to empower the children first. And Children's Councils is a place where children can participate in decision-making or policy-making and express their opinions. So I think all ministries have to work harder in that regard. As for what the Legislative Yuan is doing, I think maybe some representatives from the Legislative Yuan will respond. Did I miss any questions? Well, I would like to conclude here temporarily. Thank you. How about education and training at schools? The government attaches great importance to human rights training. So there is a education section under the Presidential Office Human Rights Advisory Group. So our current plan, it includes to promote the spirits of children's human rights. And at the MOE, Ministry of Education, there is also a planning group for human rights that and as for teachers, in December 2016, an education planning group is established, and CRC is planned to become a critical element in the training of teachers. So we do emphasize the importance that teachers have to know about CRC. And at high school students, for high school students, well, actually in their curriculum, human rights are included in their lessons. And in the civic and social studies, there are also human rights lessons. There is a civic and social studies centers that studies how to come up with better teaching materials for teachers. At elementary school and junior high schools, human rights are a part of the curriculum guideline. So there are human rights lessons at those levels of schools too. And the K-12 administration, when deciding whether to give a grant to local cities and governments, we ask these cities to provide us with the reports of human rights evaluation. So we ask local governments to conduct survey as to whether the campus in their jurisdiction are human rights friendly, children friendly, as a way to protect children's rights. Other than that, we also conduct surveys of children's life in schools. We want to understand whether children are bullied or mistreated with some disciplinary actions. With such surveys, we can tell that after learning about CRC, children get a better understanding of the rights they have. How about children-friendly complaints mechanism or channels? Let's ask the control yuan to answer. I would like to thank Ms. Landy for your question. You are from Ireland, so I think you know that Ireland, Norway, or Finland all have specialized children's ombudsman institutions. Taiwan has a similar institution. And Taiwan also the only country which has 5 branches of the government. So we have control yuan, which is equal to an ombudsman institution. So the control yuan is independent of the executive branch of the government. So we our job is to promote good governance of the government and also to protect human rights. And control yuan will receive people's complaints or conduct motions of investigations. After the investigations, if we see that the government agencies do violate human rights, including children's rights or any other international human rights instruments, that we will send a letter of opinion to ask government agencies to improve, and we will follow up with the following measures that they may take until their actions are satisfactory. Then we will close the case. And if a public servant violates laws that are related to children, they may be impeached. In a worst-case scenario, this person may not to serve in the government anymore. So these are the main responsibilities of control yuan. The commissioners at the control yuan. We have 29 commissioners, so the number is higher than many of the other ombudsmen. They're nominated by presidents and approved by legislative yuan. So, 20 among 29 commissioners, some of them are legal experts and children experts, and they do attach great importance to children's affairs. So, since there are so many commissioners who are monitoring human rights, even though Taiwan does not have a specialized children's ombudsman office, yet through the division of labor, the control yuan is able to monitor the realization of human rights for children. And control yuan has a complaint receiving center as well. And if such complaints or if such complainants are children, we will be very careful by not disclosing their identity. And we will deal with these complaints in a different fashion. We try to make the complaints mechanism more friendly to anyone, well, especially to children. And in the past several years, the control yuan has done some systemic investigations. There are 89 of them in the past 4 years. So I think the control yuan is fulfilling its responsibility to monitor human rights. And we will continue to improve those functions that are carried out by control yuan in the future. Thank you. Are there any representatives from Legislative Yuan to discuss with us the council, Children's Council or Children's Parliament? Good morning to you all. On the question whether to establish children's councils or children's parliaments. Well, Article 62 in our Constitution states that legislative yuan is the highest level in the government that can decide legislation, but there's no stipulations about children's parliaments. There are 8 committees in legislative yuan, and there is one committee, the social committee in legislative yuan is in charge of children's rights. So as to whether we can establish such a children's parliament, and it's all up to Constitution. But to revise the Constitution, the threshold is really high. 1/4 of the legislative yuan members have to jointly make that proposal, and half of the voters in Taiwan have to vote yes to the revision before the revision of the Constitution can be made. So as to whether it is possible to establish such a children's parliament in the legislative yuan, I think, as I said, the committee I just mentioned under legislative yuan is able to review bills related to children's rights. So is it feasible to establish children's parliament, or should the function be carried out by the committee? I think we need to respect the rights of the legislators and their responsibilities in carrying out these functions.
单位要来做补充。
Well, I think there are 2 questions for social and family affair administration. Okay, so the whether or not the CRC takes precedence over domestic law. According to our Implementation Act of the CRC, we have to review all the existing law, including those at the central and local government levels. Therefore, we want to make sure that all our law is in line with the CRC provisions. But the first step we have to take is to review the law. And in the process, you can see that the CRC definitely takes precedence over conflicting domestic law. So we do ask all agencies to review the laws relevant to their functions. The CRC actually is at a higher level in the hierarchy, but sometimes if we want to see if we need to amend the Constitution to stay in keeping with the CRC, it's more complicated. More discussions will be needed. As for the oversight of the implementation, starting next year, we're going to conduct a study to see how the mechanism will be established to monitor the implementation. In fact, we are also going to reference the concluding observations of the review committee, and we will then consult with local and central government agencies to see how we can fully implement the CRC provisions. I speak on behalf of the Ministry of Education. At schools, we do have students' councils or students' committees allowing students to be engaged in the management of the school. So I speak on behalf of the Ministry of Education. I think it's already mentioned that human rights education is already incorporated into the curriculum in middle school and elementary school education. So students are also taught to run their autonomous bodies. That's why there are many schools that organize little mayor elections. Each class will choose a candidate, and then through voting, the whole class can decide who their class leader will be. And in some cases, they also have like different ministers for environmental hygiene or a minister for academic affairs. According to the higher education law, there are also provisions assisting students to set up student bodies and organize elections. All students are natural members, and they can choose their own leaders of the student body. Well, any additional information from different agencies? No? In that case, I think we will end here in response to your first round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the answers, and the ministers, particular Minister of Justice and Education and representative of the legislative branch, for all your information and responses to our questions. Of course, the Ministry of Social Affairs is the lead minister in the field of children's rights. Thank you all for the questions, and I assume that there will be some follow-up questions. But I recommend the members of the committee not to engage in discussions. We can have long discussions about the 18 to 20 years old and whether the protection that the public at large, 62% thinks is necessary, is a topic for some interesting discussions, because what about the 18-year-old that has the capacity to engage in a labor contract? Is that a person who needs protection from his parents? And does the labor contract provide that parents can interfere in the labor contract between the boy and the employer? There are a lot of questions. The core problem here is, and that's what I want to raise, is the concept of the child as a person who needs protection for a long time. And there is also the matter of privacy. If you are an 18-year-old girl, would you like to be in a situation where you need the permission of your parents to see a doctor? Starts independency, all of a sudden out of the sky, and when you turn 20? Or is there a developing capacity of the child? And the child becomes more and more capable of making her or his own decisions. And we will perhaps discuss later the relation between parents and children, but there are a lot of those discussions. I am certainly pleased by the information about the CSC as a prevailing document in case there is a conflict. Of course, there is an ongoing process of reviewing the law and bring it in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But there may nevertheless raise some conflicts where there has to be made a decision by the judge what would be the prevailing, the domestic provision of the CSC. And of course, I understand that when it comes to a conflict with the Constitution, that is something of a higher level than domestic laws in general. But nevertheless, good to know that there is a prevailing role for the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Members of the committee, following up questions. I'll start with Mrs. Carr. Don't forget your microphone.
The representative of the legislative yuan, 2 questions. The first one is whether you have considered to establish a special committee in the legislative yuan that is special for children, because the committee of the dealing with children issues has to deal with many other issues, not necessarily concerned with children. And I think that in my country anyway, we have in the legislature, in parliament, a special committee for children, which could raise questions and even promote legislation as necessary when problems arise. My second question is, I understand that government insists on amending the law regarding the different ages of marriage. And it falls all the time for years in the legislative yuan. So what are the real difficulties, or what are the considerations that make Parliament not go on with the amendments? What are the principles that lead those who antagonize the amendment? If we understand this, maybe we can better recommend of how the country can proceed with something that in my opinion, all the review committees that were before us recommended to amend. Now, as for I don't intend to go into discussion with regard to the age of 18 and 20, but I understand that this civil code and this legislation is 88 years old, and time is changing, education is changing, the world is changing, and you still insist that you have to protect children in these ages, while you made your decision that a child of 18 can decide to get married. This was on the most difficult decision that a person can make if to marry. And this is allowed, and you assume that the 18, they have the mental capacity to decide on marriage, but you think at the same time that he doesn't have the mental capacity to be involved in administrative decision, in bringing complaints to the court. I wonder what is the difference why is the difference in the mental capacity of a person to be able to decide on very difficult issues and not be able to bring his case before the court? Now understand that even the age of 18 is the age of termination of the special protection measures. And the subsidies for disadvantaged children. Now, this is the end of protection. So what is the idea of proceeding with protection in a very special field of court proceedings and administrative proceedings? Now, I would like to understand also about human rights education. You're speaking about human rights and that it enters into curriculum. I would like to understand, speaking about human rights education, is it obligatory to teach children on the special rights of children? Because it's one thing, human rights, and it's a wider issue, but teaching about the Convention's right of the child is more focused on the rights of children, and I wonder whether this is obligatory and whether the training, human rights training as a subject, what focus does it has on the CRC? And another question is whether you have enough budget or the right budget for the training, for an effective training. And I would like to ask also about the parental schools, that it's very important, I think, to teach parents about children's rights, or to make better the dialogue between parents and children in the understanding that children are not property. Again, with budget of training, I understand that the one problem of the education system is substitute teachers. And those teachers are teachers for not as steady teachers. Do they have the training of human rights and children's rights? Are they enough professionally aware of their roles as a result of such training, if they have it at all? With regard to implementation, I would like to ask, what is the role of the implementation committee and the promotional teams? What do they do? And lastly, the control yuan. I would like to hear some of the issues among the 89 subjects that the control yuan dealt with. What were the cases? What were the results? And how does complaint reach the control yuan? I mean, you are working along complaints, but if the way to bring a complaint before the control yuan is not child-friendly, how do you make it sure the children can apply to the control yuan, not through the teachers or not through adults, but directly? Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Garb. Lundy.
Again, thank you for the answers to the questions. I want to echo one of the points made by Mrs. Karp, and that is in relation to human rights education. My question was, is there specific children's rights education, not a discretion? We know in many countries teachers find it easier to teach human rights of others and not teach children their own rights. It's really important that it's a specific children's rights training. And likewise, I echo her last point about the control yuan. I was interested as well of the 89 systemic investigations, how many of those related to children. I also want to ask how many complaints were made by or on behalf of children, perhaps in the last 5 years. How many people were impeached because of a complaint made by a child? What kind of statistics are we dealing with? And can children make a complaint themselves, or do they have to do it through a parent? Some very brief other clarification on the issue of coordination. And you've told us again that there are promotional groups in the executive yuan and in the ministerial level. And I want to be clear what promotional group means. Is that just a group that discusses and encourages? Does it have any power of any sort to direct action within departments or ministries? Does it have any budget? Or is it just somewhere where issues are talked about? In relation to budgeting, I asked about transparency of budgeting and accessible budgeting information for children. This is quite a significant child rights issue. There is a new general comment specifically saying that budgetary information should be accessible to children. And I don't think that most children would find the government's budget information on the web. Most adults would find that very hard, including me. So I think it's important that there is information for children. I understand that there is a move in some of the local councils for participatory budgeting, which I think is a really good thing. My question is that just adults who engage in participatory budgeting at local council level? Is there any scope for children to be involved, being consulted on how money is spent on their behalf? And I'm going to leave that there. That's my questions. Yeah.
No. Those are so far the questions. There is one on the control yuan. Ombudsperson's functions are functions limited to possible violation of human rights in the governmental circles. As a yuan, you don't deal with my complaint as a child about how I was treated in a private school, how I was treated at a sports club or sports event. you don't deal with that, so your role is quite limited. Children may have complaints about governmental authorities, but in their daily life, they may be in contact with governmental authorities, but there are many other contacts they have in their daily life and things that happen there. If they want to complain about it, they may do that and talk to their parents, but in terms of the legal aspects of complaining, the control gun is a limited opportunity for children. You have the floor, Madam, for the additional follow-up questions.
Okay, so there are some follow-up questions after your responses. First of all, can Legislative Yuan establish a children's special committee because the social and environmental hygiene committee is not enough? So will we have a special committee for children at the Legislative Yuan? And the draft to change maturity age from 20 to 18, why hasn't it been passed yet? What are the difficulties? Thirdly, the third question is directed to MOJ. Well, time has changed, so maybe the age of maturity has to be adjusted as well, because people who are 18 can get married, and that's a very important decision, whereas people at 18 have to wait for another 2 years before they can decide some legal matters for themselves. Why is that? The fourth question for Ministry of Education, please clarify as to how you can truly let children understand what their rights are. Please provide more details as to how you help children understand their rights. How do teachers teach about human rights? Do we have enough budget to help teachers to teach? I think I will ask the Social and Family Affairs Administration to talk about the role of Child and Youth Welfare and Rights Promotion Group at the Executive Yuan. So the first question will be directed to Control Yuan. You said earlier that there were 89 or 86 investigation cases. Were they issued by the children or by the parents? When you receive the complaints, how are these complaints handled? Maybe these investigations are or are not friendly enough to the children, and the Control Yuan deals with affairs that are related to public employees. How about issues that do not happen or are not associated with public affairs? So I would like to give the floor to the Legislative Yuan representative. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I think earlier we mentioned whether it's feasible to establish a children's special committee. Well, according to the Legislative Yuan Organization Act, legislators may submit such a proposal, but all of these bills have to be passed by the legislators. So is it feasible to set up such a committee? It's dependent upon the legislators themselves. They may decide to or not to set up such a committee. So legislators themselves may have different opinions. Maybe each one of them all have their different opinion. So if such a bill is proposed, then the legislators have to reach consensus. Then they will pass the bill. I think NGOs and other government agencies can make their input too. Maybe some NGOs had to talk about this with the committee members yesterday. I'm not sure. Okay, next, Ministry of Justice. Why the proposal to change age of maturity has not yet been passed after so many years? Please let us know what the challenges are. Ms. Carp. We said earlier that in 2011, an MOJ took the initiative to adjust the marriage age for women, adjusted it to 18, just like that for men. But when this proposal is being reviewed by the Legislative Yuan, the legislators had different opinions because some of the legislators thought that in the past, 16-year-old girls could get married. But if we change the age of marriage, then young girls have to wait until 18. So that's 2 years later than before. And legislators have also noticed that every year, around 500 girls between 16 and 18 got married. So if we do change the law, then some younger girls who may want to get married earlier but are not allowed to do so because of this change. So, in fact, this number or these doubts was indicated by some legislators back in 2011. Some of them thought that it's going to delay the marriage time of some young girls who wanted to get married. I also mentioned earlier that in 2014 and 2016, that legislators submit another proposal. So this one was not submitted by the MOJ, but by the legislators themselves. And in reviewing this bill, the legislators did not talk about the same concern that they had back in 2011. Maybe it is because that Taiwan has adopted ICCPR, ICECR, and CEDAW, and many of these human rights conventions indicate that such an age difference is discriminatory and it hurts children's rights, children who are between 16 to 18. And the review that was made at the Legislative Yuan in 2014 and 16 was also associated with same-sex marriage. And Legislative Yuan at the time did not have that much dispute on the age to marriage for girls. So in 2016, the latest proposal is supported by legislators from different parties. They all want to change the marriage age for girls from 16 to 18. So legislators from different parties show their support to this change. And the executive branch of the government, by which I mean Ministry of Justice, believe that this change met the spirits of the two covenants and CEDAW. And in the gender equity guideline under Executive Yuan, takes into consideration the recommendation made by CEDAW committee, that is to adjust the age of marriage so that both men and women can get married at the same age, 18. And this proposal or this bill is still being reviewed by the Legislative Yuan, and the administrative and the executive branch of the government will continue to, ask such a bill to be passed. So maybe we need more dialogue between the executive branch and the legislative branch and the general public. If there's a consensus amongst these three stakeholders, then this bill will be more likely to be passed. if there's a higher consensus, I think the chances for such a bill to be passed is also higher. I think MOE, Ministry of Education, it didn't really tell the details. What content do you use? Because human rights are very wide, and children's rights are a smaller scope. So what exactly did you do to help schools to teach about children's rights, not just human rights? Thank you for the questions. Human rights is very important in our education system. So in the 9-year curriculum plan for elementary and junior high school students, we taught about rules, rights, and human rights. So such a guideline is decided by the government. And teachers themselves, when they actually teach, they have the discretion. They can decide whether or not they will also teach about children's rights. It's the rights of the teachers to decide what he or she wants to teach. But whatever they teach, the content has to meet the guideline requirements made by the government. I think substitution teachers was also mentioned earlier. Even though they are substitute teachers, they are qualified to teach. So in their training, they were trained to teach such subject. In the training of the teachers, these teachers are taught about human rights and also CRC. In addition, in on-the-job training for teachers, there are also some lessons on such topics. As for training for education, and to help them understand about CRC, well, and in fact, we set up family education centers at the local level. We work with the schools and local government to have some workshops or seminars, and we will also include CRC in such workshops. Besides that, there's a CRC website which we utilize to help children themselves or the general public to understand the content of CRC and the rights children have. Thank you. How about Social and Family Affairs Administration? Okay, I think there are two questions that I am going to respond. First one is about budget transparency. Well, such budgeting information is published on our CRC website. Of course, we are still establishing a children-friendly version of the website. So in the future, children will find their version of the website more friendly and accessible. And it was also asked about what the promotional teams at the ministry and the executive yuan actually do. Well, they have different roles and responsibilities. At the executive yuan, the promotional group will include ministry heads and scholars and public representatives. When they meet, they talk about the content of the Implementation Act of CRC and CRC itself. They also work together to encourage all government agencies to implement CRC. And they also talk about issues when it comes to implementation. They also discuss policies or the review of current policies and legislation. And at the ministry level, the promotional team will follow the children and youth Rights and Welfare Protection Act. But we know that CRC has the precedence. So we, at the ministry level, they review this Taiwan Act and compare it to CRC to see if it is necessary to revise the Protection Act for children and youth rights and welfare. So at the executive yuan, it is possible to do some inter-ministry coordination. So these two promotional teams do have different roles and responsibilities.
好，我们的个案的情形。
Okay, so please provide more detailed information with regards to the complaints mechanism at the control yuan. People can come to the control yuan. For example, if a person is a human rights victim, he can come to the control yuan to file complaints. This may be rare if the victim is a child, but his family members can come to the control yuan to file complaints. Or an NGO involved in child welfare issues can also file complaints. So this is how we receive complaints. Well, I also said that we can take the initiative to start an investigation. We can motion an investigation. For example, based on news reports of significant violations of human rights or children's rights, we at the control yuan can motion an investigation. In addition, based on our experience, if we discover a systematic problem, then we can initiate a systemic investigation to look into a particular problem. And then we will tell the government agencies to make improvements or corrections. So this is how we handle complaints. Moreover, we do have an INTAC, a particular center staffed with volunteers to receive complaints. We also have staff members on duty every day to receive complaints made by complainants. So we do have an internal mechanism. But of course, we are not receiving only complaints about children's rights violations, infringement on the human rights of people with disabilities or women are also within our purview. The question about whether or not the control yuan can handle complaints filed by members from the private sector, we are dedicated to promoting good governance at the public sector. But we can imagine that there are competent authorities in charge of different groups of citizens, and when their human rights are being infringed upon, the competent authorities will step in. So if a child's human right is violated, the competent authority will take necessary action right away. If not, we, of course, will step in and ask the competent authorities to make necessary improvements or even discipline their staff members. Can I give you an example? Yes. In 2013, a juvenile was sent to a reformatory school in Taoyuan because of some criminal offenses. At that reformatory school, the juvenile was harmed and the teenager died in the end. And because of this, the control yuan impeached 3 government employees. a similar incident occurred in another reformatory school, we again impeached 4 department heads. So these are all significant cases where lives were lost. Of course, we would take active actions to address it. The question about the control yuan can only handle complaints that involves the public sector. Should Taiwan set up a national human rights commission in line with the Paris Principle? In fact, the day after tomorrow, the presidential office is going to discuss how the control yuan's functions can be strengthened via revisions to existing laws. In the wake of necessary legal amendments and revisions, maybe the ombudsman, the control yuan, will be able to do more. However, revisions to the law will be needed for these to take place. So we will express our views in that meeting in the day after tomorrow. It is hoped that the control yuan can be transformed into an ombudsman that is totally in keeping with the Paris Principles. We would like to strengthen our function in the existing design of our government. We will participate in that discussion and express our views for sure. Thank you. The Ministry of Justice? Yes, please. Good morning. I would like to explain the controversy involving the age of majority. There are different provisions regarding the age of majority in different countries, ranging from 18 to 21. Again, I think it is in the purview of different countries' legislative power. Again, local conditions must be taken into account. Secondly, can a 20-year-old be responsible for all his actions? The civil code involves the change or the transfer of property. Therefore, however, the age of marriage is different. The civil code stipulates very complicated legal relations. For example, contractual relationships. They can be very complex. In Taiwan, those aged between 18 and 20, 18 and 19-year-olds are usually students. They are not independent economically, financially. They may not have the sufficient knowledge to engage in contractual acts or legal acts that involve the transfer of property. So they can still engage in signing contracts, but consent from their parents will be the prerequisite to protect the rights of the child. So now, the crux of the problem is, are 18 and 19-year-olds equipped with sufficient capacity to be held accountable for their own actions? So, are 18 and 19-year-olds mature enough to be responsible for their own actions? Here we are talking about the right to property. So for the sake of protecting children, we prefer to maintain the status quo before consensus is forged among the majority of our citizens. it's not that the competent authorities can decide what to do on its own. Rather, any new law or revisions to law will have to take into account public opinion. Thank you. Chair, I speak on behalf of the Ministry of Labor. There was a question about why an employment contract will not be valid if there's no parental consent. In fact, for child labor and those who are under the age of 18, if they want to engage in any employment contracts, parental consent will have to be obtained. This is to make sure they follow the Labor Standard Act as well as the Labor Safety Act. Those who are under the age of 16, they are defined as child workers. And for those who are aged between 16 to 18, the law says that they cannot engage in dangerous work. And for those who are above 18, less than 20, they will have to get parental consent before they can work for a particular employer. So we would like to promote open government. More participation from the public is welcomed and encouraged. We hope that in the decision and the policy-making process, more public participation will be enabled. Another issue is how we view children. Do we deem children to be people with full capacity? It seems that we still cling to the paternalist approach. When we view children, they cannot make decisions on their own, even when they are 18 or 19-year-old. Another question is, can children take part in the budgeting process, or can they take part in the review of government or public budgets? Again, a lot of empowerment will have to take place before that can happen. So we need to have a new approach to look at children and the relationship between parent and child before we can fully stay in keeping with the CRC.
Thank you very much, Madam. I have one simple question for the representative of the Minister of Justice. Did I understand correctly? Let's take an example. There is a 16-year-old girl abused by her father, and it turns out to be necessary to place that girl in a foster care institution or in a children's home. The same happens to a girl of 18. Is it in that case possible for the judge to order the placement of the 18-year-old in a children's home or in foster care? So I would appreciate to have an answer from the representative of the Ministry of Justice to that question. Is that possible in both cases or only for the 16-year-old?
I think the Ministry of Justice, it's up to the judge's decision. You got the question right. So we're talking about an 18-year-old, a 16-year-old. How will that impact the court's decision? The Judicial Yuan or the Ministry of Justice? The Judicial Yuan, please. Thank you for the question. According to Children and Youth Welfare Act, those under the age of 18, when abused, will be put into the protective program. What exactly are we going to do for an 18-year-old versus a 16-year-old? For a 16-year-old, what kind of decisions would you make? For an 18-year-old, what kind of decision would you make? Institutional placement. So when you judges make decisions, the age of the child, how will that impact your decision? That's the crux of the question.
Well, when judges make judgment for placement, age is not a factor. As long as this person is under 18 years old and is abused by violence, and the judge may send him or her to placement. But the courts do not decide which institution this person goes to, because the placement decision is made by the executive or the administrative agency.
Yeah, but can I continue just for my understanding? So what you are telling me is we judges don't place or don't deal with cases of 18 or 19-year-olds who are victims of abuse at home because it's not under the Child Welfare Protection Act. Is that a correct conclusion of your words?
Right. So would you like to continue to respond? So according to the Children and Youth Rights and Welfare Act, people who are between 18 and 20 in terms of emergency placement. That is to say, if there is serious domestic violence and therefore it is necessary to take this person between 18 to 20 out from the family, that's what we deem an emergency. In that case, to protect this person's freedom and liberty, these people between 18 and 20 can still be protected under the Children's and Youth Rights and Welfare Act. Okay, maybe the MOJ, would you like to supplement some answers, because the previous answer was probably not sufficient. Okay, in our country, be it an adult or between adults or a child, and placement is not decided upon the age factor. The necessity is a factor, but not the age. For example, an 18-year-old girl suffers sexual abuse within the family, then we look at the risks that she's going to have. If she maintains in the family, we conduct analysis with the victim. If she needs the placement, then we provide placement. And the social worker can make that decision within 72 hours. If we think placement is needed, then we will submit the application to the court.
Okay. No, we are going to terminate this part because we take a short break and then we continue with chapter or cluster 3. We have to try to stay within reasonable time limits. So anybody who needs coffee, tea, or something else, be back in 10 minutes. At 11, we resume the meeting. Meeting is suspended.
10 minutes or 20 minutes? Just make clear, clarification. 10 minutes or 20 minutes? Now
10 minutes.
10 minutes, so back
Well,
here 11.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay, we're back to here 11.
What it means is that they are back in 15 minutes.
Okay, okay.
So 10 minutes.
Okay, okay.
各位贵宾，第一场次审查会议到此结束。场外备有咖啡与热茶，欢迎各位贵宾享用。我们将在11点接续第一场次的审查会议，谢谢。